75C, Democratic Societies. Genet's faction fell from power in Paris, and he subsequently sought political asylum in the United States. But his disappearance from the diplomatic scene did not diminish the impact of the French Revolution in America. Clubs called Democratic Societies, formed by Americans sympathetic to the French Revolution, perpetuated the domestic divisions Genet had helped to widen. More than 40 such societies organized between 1793 and 1800. Their members cast themselves in the mold of the 1760s resistance movement as defenders of fragile liberty from corrupt and self-serving Federalist rulers. The rapid spread of citizens groups outspokenly critical of the administration disturbed Hamilton and Washington. Federalist writers charged that the society's true intention was to involve the country in war, to assume the reins of government and tyrannize over the people. The counterattack climaxed in the fall of 1794 when Washington accused the clubs of fomenting the Whiskey Rebellion. In retrospect, the administration's reaction seems disproportionately hostile, but as the first organized political dissenters in the United States, the Democratic Societies alarmed officials who had not yet accepted the idea of that one component of a free government was an organized loyal opposition. 75D, Jay Treaty Debate. In 1794, George Washington dispatched Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate several unsolved questions in Anglo-American relations. The British had recently seized some American merchant ships trading in the French West Indies. The United States wanted to establish the principle of freedom of the seas and to assert its right as a neutral nation to unfettered trade with both combatants. Further, Great Britain still held post in the American Northwest, thus violating the 1783 peace treaty. Settlers there believed the British responsible for renewed warfare with neighboring native peoples, and they wanted that threat removed. Southern planters also wanted compensation for the slaves who left with the British Army after the war. Jay had little to offer the British in exchange for the concessions he sought. Britain agreed to evacuate the western forts and reduce restrictions on American trade to England and the Caribbean. The treaty established two arbitration commissions, one to deal with pre-war debt Americans owed to British creditors, and the other to hear claims for captured American merchant ships. But Britain adamantly refused to compensate slave owners for their lost human property. Under the circumstances, Jay had probably done the best he could. Nevertheless, most Americans, including the president, at first expressed dissatisfaction with the treaty. The Senate debated the Jay Treaty in secret. Not until after its narrow ratification in June 1795 did the public learn its provisions in the pages of the leading Republican newspaper, Benjamin Franklin's Botch's Aurora. Bocce organized the protests that followed. Publications and popular gatherings urging Washington to reject the treaty. Federalists countered with rallies and essays of their own, contending that Jay's treaty was preferable to no treaty at all. Displeased by the Republicans' organized opposition and convinced by pro-treaty arguments, Washington signed the pact in mid-August. Just one opportunity remained to prevent it from taking effect. Congress had to appropriate funds to carry out the treaty, and appropriation bills had to originate in the House of Representatives. Hoping the opposition would dissipate, Washington delayed submitting the treaty in the House until March 1796. The treaty's congressional opponents initially commanded a majority, but pressure for appropriating the necessary funds built quickly. Federalists successfully linked the Jay Treaty with another, more popular pact that Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina had negotiated with Spain the previous year. Pinckney's treaty gave the United States valuable navigation privileges on the Mississippi River and the right to land and store goods at New Orleans tax-free. The Senate ratified it unanimously, and the overwhelming support it received helped to overcome opposition to the Jay Treaty. In late April, a divided House appropriated the money by a 3-vote margin, but all but 2 Southerners opposed the treaty. All but 3 Federalists supported it. Ironically, the Federalist campaign to sway public opinion violated their fundamental philosophy of government. Of elected leaders, yet in order to persuade the House of following the president's lead, they actively engaged in grassroots politicking. Even Federalist women became involved by presenting patriotic banners to militia companies or by taking formal roles in July 4th celebrations. The Federalists won the battle, but in the long run, they would lose the war because Republicans ultimately proved far more effective in appealing to the citizenry at large. To describe the growing partisanship in Congress and the nation is easier than to explain such fractures in the electorate. The terms used by Jefferson and Madison, the people versus aristocrats, or by Hamilton and Washington, true patriots versus submersive rabble, do not adequately describe the growing divisions. Simple economic differences between farmers and city folk do not provide the answer either, as more than 90% of Americans still lived in rural areas. Moreover, Jefferson's vision of a prosperous agrarian America rested on commercial farming, not rural self-sufficiency. Nor did the divisions in the 1790s simply repeat the ratification debates of 1787 and 1788. Even though most anti-Federalists became Republicans, the party's leaders, Madison and Jefferson, had supported the Constitution. Yet certain distinctions can be made. Republicans, especially strong in the southern and middle states, tended to be self-assured, confident, and optimistic. Southern planters, in control of their region and their bound labor force, foresaw a prosperous future fueled by continued westward expansion. Republicans employed Democratic rhetoric to win the allegiances of small farmers in southern and mid-Atlantic states. Members of non-English ethnic groups found Republicans' message attractive. Artisans, like small farmers, fierce believers in household autonomy, joined the coalition. Republicans of all descriptions prized America's internal resources, remaining sympathetic to France, but worrying less about the nation's place in the world than Federalists did. By contrast, Federalists concentrated among the commercial interests of New England. They stressed the need for order, hierarchy, and obedience to political authority. Federalists, like their Republican opponents, realized that Southern and Middle state interest would dominate Western lands, so they had little incentive to focus on that potentially rich territory. Where Republicans faced west, Federalists faced east, toward London. In their eyes, the nation's internal and external enemies made alliance with Great Britain essential. Given the dangers posed to the nation by European warfare, Federalist vision of international affairs may have been accurate, but it was also unappealing. Federalists offered voters little hope of a better future, and the Republicans prevailed in the end. 7.5e, Washington's Farewell Address. After the treaty debate, wearied by the criticism to which he had been subjected, George Washington decided not to seek re-election. Presidents had not yet been limited to 2 terms at this time. In September, Washington published his farewell address, most of which Hamilton wrote. The address outlined 2 principles that guided American foreign policy, at least until the late 1940s. To maintain commercial but not political ties to other nations, and to reject permanent alliances. Washington also drew sharp distinctions between the United States and Europe, stressing America's uniqueness. its exceptionalism, and the need for independent action in foreign affairs, today called unilateralism. Some interpret Washington's plea for an end to partisan strife as a call for politicians to consider the good of the whole nation. But in the context of the impending presidential election, the farewell address appears rather as an attack on the Republican opposition. Washington advocated unity behind the Federalist banner, which he viewed as the only power stance. The Federalists, like the Republicans, continued to see themselves as the rightful heirs of the Revolution. Both sides perceived their opponents as illegitimate, unpatriotic troublemakers who sought to undermine revolutionary ideals. The Republican Aurora derided the address as empty words. Washington's administration had excelled at the profession of republicanism, but the practice of monarchy and aristocracy, editor Botch wrote. Surely the men of the Revolution who still feel its principles and its sympathies would not follow a different and better course than the one the Federalists had charted. 7.5f, the election of 1796. The two organized groups actively contending for office made the presidential election of 1796 the first serious contest for the position. To succeed Washington, the Federalists in Congress put forward Vice President John Adams, with the diplomat Thomas Pinckney as his running mate. Congressional Republicans chose Thomas Jefferson as their presidential candidate. The lawyer, Revolutionary War veteran, and Republican politician Aaron Burr of New York agreed to stand for vice president. But the method of voting in the Electoral College did not take into account the possibility of party slates. The Constitution's drafters had not foreseen the emergence of competing political organizations, so the document provided no way to express support for a ticket that included one candidate for president and another for vice president. The electors simply voted for two people. The man with the highest total became president, the second highest, vice president. That procedure proved to be the Federalist undoing. Adams won the presidency with 71 votes, but a number of Federalist electors failed to cast ballots for Pinckney. With 68 votes, the next highest total, Jefferson, would become vice president. During the next 4 years, the new president and vice president, once allies and close friends, became bitter enemies. 7.5g, the XYZ affair. As president, John Adams clung to an outdated notion discarded by George Washington as early as 1794, that the president should remain above politics. Thus, Adams kept Washington's cabinet intact, despite its key members' allegiance to his chief Federalist rival, Alexander Hamilton. Adams often adopted a passive posture, letting others take the lead when the president should have acted decisively. But Adams' detachment from Hamilton's maneuverings did enable him to weather the greatest international crisis the Republic had yet faced. The Jay Treaty had improved American relationships with Great Britain, but it provoked France to retaliate by seizing American vessels carrying British goods. In response, Congress authorized the building of ships and the stockpiling of weapons and ammunition. President Adams also sent 3 commissioners to Paris to negotiate a settlement. For months, the American commissioners sought talks with Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, but Talleyrand's agents demanded a bribe of $250,000 before negotiations could even begin. The Americans retorted, "No, not a sixpence," and reported the incident in dispatches the president received in March 1798. Adams informed Congress and recommended further increase in military spending. Convinced that Adams had deliberately sabotaged the negotiations, Republicans insisted that the dispatches be turned over to Congress. Adams complied, withholding only the names of the French agents, whom he labeled as X, Y, and Z. The revelation that the Americans had been treated with contempt stimulated a wave of anti-French sentiment in the United States, and became known as the XYZ affair. One journalist's version of the commissioner's reply, quote, "millions for defense, but not a cent for tribute," became a national slogan. Congress formally abrogated the Treaty of Alliance and authorized American ships to commandeer French vessels. 75H, quasi-war with France. Thus began an undeclared war with France, fought in Caribbean waters between warships of the U.S. Navy and French privateers. Although Americans initially suffered heavy losses, by early 1799, the U.S. Navy had established its superiority, easing the threat to America's vital Caribbean trade. The Republicans, who opposed war and continued to sympathize with France, could do little to stem the tide of anti-French feelings. Because Agent Y had boasted of the existence of a, quote, "French party in America," Federalists flatly accused Republicans of traitorous designs. John Adams wavered between denouncing the Republicans and acknowledging their right to oppose administration measures. His wife was less tolerant. Quote, "Those whom the French boast of as their partisans," Abigail Adams declared, "should be adjudged traitors to their country." 75I, Alien and Sedition Acts. Federalists saw an opportunity to deal a death blow to their Republican opponents. Now that the country seemed to see the truth of what they had been saying ever since the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, that Republicans were subservient foreign agents, Federalists could codify that belief. In 1798, the Federalist-controlled Congress adopted a set of 4 laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, intended to weaken the Republicans' faction. 3 of the acts targeted recently arrived immigrants whose Federalists accurately suspected of sympathizing with Republicans. The Naturalization Act lengthened the residency period required for citizenship and ordered all resident aliens to register with the federal government. The 2 Alien Acts, though not immediately implemented, provided for the detention of enemy aliens during wartime and gave the president authority to deport any alien he deemed dangerous to the nation's security. The 4th statute, the Sedition Act, sought to control both citizens and aliens. It outlawed conspiracies to prevent the enforcement of federal law, setting the maximum punishment for such offenses at 5 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. The act also made writing, printing, and uttering false, scandalous, and malicious statements with intent to defame the government or the president a crime punishable by as much as 2 years imprisonment and a fine of $2,000. Today, a law punishing political speech would be unconstitutional. But in the 18th century, when organized opposition was suspect, many American supported such restrictions on free speech. The Sedition Act led to 15 indictments and 10 guilty verdicts. Among those convicted were a congressman and former newspaper editor, Matthew Lyon of Vermont, and James Callender, a Scots immigrant and scandalmonger whose exposés forced Alexander Hamilton to acknowledge an extramarital affair. After turning his attention to President Adams, Callender was convicted, fined, and jailed for 9 months. Energized rather than silenced by the persecution, growing numbers of Republican newspaper editors stepped up their relentless criticisms. One of the most outspoken, William Duane, successor to Bach as the Aurora's editor, ignored a Sedition Act indictment, prosecutions in state and federal courts for other purported offenses, and even a vicious beating by Federalist thugs to persist in partisan attacks. He and other Republicans created an informal network of newspapers that spread opposition ideas throughout the country. Jefferson and Madison combated the acts in another way. Petitioning the Federalist-controlled Congress to repeal the law would clearly fail, and Federalist judges refused to allow accused individuals to question the Sedition Act's constitutionality. Accordingly, Republican leaders turned to the only other forum available for formal protest: state legislatures. Carefully concealing their own roles, Jefferson and Madison drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which were introduced into those states' legislatures respectively in the fall of 1798. Because a compact among the states had created the Constitution, the resolutions contended people speaking through their states had a legitimate right to judge the constitutionality of actions taken by the federal government. Both legislatures pronounced the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional, thus advancing the doctrine later known as nullification. Although no other state endorsed them, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions placed the opposition party squarely in the revolutionary tradition of resistance to tyrannical authority. Their theory of union inspired the Hartford Convention of 1814 and Southern states' rights advocates in the 1830s and thereafter. Jefferson and Madison had identified a key constitutional issue. How far could states go in opposing the national government? How could conflicts between the two be resolved? These questions would not be definitively answered until the Civil War. 7.5J, the Convention of 1800. Just as Northern legislatures were rejecting the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, Federalists split over the course of action the United States should take toward France. Hamilton and his supporters called for a declaration legitimizing the undeclared naval war. Adams, though, received a number of private signals that the French government regretted its treatment of the American commissioners. In response, he dispatched William Vans Murray to Paris to negotiate with Napoleon Bonaparte, France's new leader. The United States wanted to receive compensation for ships the French had seized since 1793 and to abrogate the Treaty of 1778. The Convention of 1800, which ended the quasi-war, conceded only the latter point. Still, it freed the United States from its only permanent alliance, thus allowing the nation to follow the independent course George Washington had urged in his farewell address. The end.